Disclaimer. Due to the subject matter of this video, I'll be using the terminology I am familiar with. Due to me being more familiar with the Japanese version of the show, I will be saying things in a way that may be unorthodox to the many dub fans out there. Just know, we are talking about the same franchise here. If you need clarification, or are just confused on what I'm saying, feel free to ask questions in the comments below. Dragon Ball is a series near and dear to my heart. Ever since I was a child, I was constantly thinking of how awesome it would be to be a part of the main cast. Goku, Tenshinhan, Yamcha, Piccolo, Kuririn, not to mention Gohan, all some of my role models as a kid. Every attack, every line, every piece of backstory, every form of Super Saiyan was permanently etched into my mind forever. That is, until I became an edgy youngster teen and proceeded to forget it all. Yeah, for a while I stopped thinking that Dragon Ball was cool. It was such a major part of my life that I always wondered how I forgot it as quickly as I got into it. I was never that big of a Dragon Ball fan. It was just when you're a child, you're naturally engrossed into whatever you're viewing. To put what I just said into perspective, I used to think that Dragon Ball GT was a prequel, and that the Bardock special took place in it, alongside movie 8, which was the movie that introduced Broly as a character back in 1993. I still knew that Super Saiyan 4 existed, but since I didn't watch GT, I thought that was the first Super Saiyan form alongside the Great Ape. I was not the brightest kid. In fact, I never actually watched the anime. I remember seeing some early episodes of the Funimation Z dub and the entirety of their Dragon Ball dub, but the majority of my knowledge came from reading some of Viz's Dragon Ball Z manga, and yes, that was in heavy air quotes, watching Funimation's Dragon Ball Kai dub, and playing Budokai Tenkaichi 2 with my brother. It wasn't until several years ago where I really started taking Dragon Ball seriously, and not until around last year where I became the designated Dragon Ball expert of our friend group. As previously stated, I wasn't always like this. Before Dragon Ball Super aired, I was such an XD normie that I was forgetting major key details of the story. I was legitimately surprised that Gohan was an adult when I watched the first episode of Super. I actually forgot that the entire Majin Buu arc featured Gohan as an adult until I thought about it for a while. Mind you, by this point, I was not taking the show seriously. In fact, this is what made me into what I am now. I was never fully attached to a specific version of the show. I forgot what the dub voices sounded like, I forgot the dub score, I forgot entire plot points, and even some characters entirely. But one thing I did have a deep personal connection to was the music of Dragon Ball Kai. I feel that I'm lucky enough to not be blinded by nostalgia. What I'm nostalgic for is not in any way related to voice acting. What's great about the Kai OST is that it's not version exclusive. When I talk about Kai, it's never Kikuchi versus Falcon. I unknowingly put myself into a very interesting situation. Due to never being exposed to the two different sides of the fandom, I could sit on the sidelines and be critical of both versions, the Japanese sub and the original Funimation dub. After a brief consideration period, and due to the fact that by this point I was watching Super in Japanese for months, I switched permanently, or more accurately, finally adjusted myself to the Japanese version. However, I do need to stress this point because I felt like I haven't done this yet. You are allowed to like whichever form of the show you like. It makes me happy that people love Dragon Ball throughout the world, and the last thing I want to do is put a damper on your fun. But I do feel that when people are exposed to nostalgia in a specific medium, it can cause a very small subsection of viewers to end up being somewhat close-minded. And while that portion of the viewership is in the minority, I always see these viewpoints expressed by people on Reddit and other social media platforms day in and day out. I'm about to switch gears and start talking about the actual Japanese version, mainly because I feel like this has gone on for too long, and I'm tired of writing the script. I feel that the most controversial opinion about the sub versus dub debate is the definitive voice for the main character Son Goku. As many of you know, Son Goku was voiced, in the Japanese version, by the cheery, adventurous, and optimistic Masako Nozawa, while in the dub he is voiced by the gritty, but oddly surfer bro-esque voice portrayed by Sean Schemmel. I can completely understand being confused when first hearing Masako Nozawa's voice for the character of Son Goku. It is a lot more high-pitched than you would naturally expect. However, I have a rebuttal. In order for you to fully understand what I'm talking about, I need to inform you of an incredibly rare and ancient artifact I have in my possession. This is not known to many people, and is only known to the most extreme of anime archaeologists. A little-known show that began production an entire 3 years before the fate of Dragon Ball Z. A show that, in name alone, holds mystery and intrigue to many people throughout the world. This anime was known as Dragon Ball, adapting the first 16.5 volumes of the Dragon Ball manga, written and illustrated by the famous manga artist Akira Toriyama. This show was a staple in anime history, but is most commonly forgotten by the masses, mainly consisting of the overwhelming amount of fans of the Dragon Ball Z anime in the United States of America. This is the precursor to Dragon Ball Z, This is how the story began, and this joke has gone on for way too long. In all seriousness, people tend to forget that before the Dragon Ball Z anime began in 1989, Dragon Ball was airing 3 years beforehand. Unlike with the English side of things, Masako Nozawa has always been the voice of Goku. No time in the entire 30 years of the franchise existing did she not voice that character. One thing that people tend to avoid doing when recommending Dragon Ball to their friends and family is to watch Dragon Ball first. After all, Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z are adaptations of the exact same manga, with the exact same name viz. The most common criticism of Masako Nozawa's voice is that it may not fit the character. I'll leave the bulk of my response to a potential video I might make later explaining Son Goku's character in more detail, but all you need to know now is that she has been the voice of Goku for so long and for so many people that by this point she just is Goku. One thing I will say is that she is nowhere near as good as she used to be. She is, and will always be, my go-to Goku voice. But she hasn't been able to reach the peaks of voice acting she used to. Many tend to look at her voicing Goku in Dragon Ball Super during the time when she was in her late 70s and early 80s and think, well, he's always been voiced by an old lady. This could just be another unintended consequence of the dub's insistence on using voices that are not necessarily accurate to the Japanese version, and having Dragon Ball Super being the first time that people hear Masako Nozawa as the character. I don't think I need to remind people that the series started back in 1986 and ran until 1997 with Dragon Ball GT. She was much younger back then and well into her prime. And to end the "it doesn't fit the character" debate, Akira Toriyama handpicked her to voice his character and continues to support that decision to this day. Another thing to talk about is the difference in music. Along with the voice of Goku, the music is what people tend to get the most heated about. Both scores portray their respective versions in very different lights. The score in the original Japanese version of the show was comprised by Shunsuke Kikuchi, while the English dub score was composed by Falconer Productions. I'm completely willing to admit that I know absolutely nothing about the technical side of music, so I will try to explain the differences in these two soundtracks the best I can, while trying to avoid the words upbeat, fast, and slow. The Kikuchi score went for a more adventurous and optimistic approach, using an orchestra to tell the story of adventurous and optimistic Son Goku, while the Falconer score used heavier sounds and more intense instruments to craft a soundtrack that was straight out of the 90s. It really comes down to what you perceive the show as. Most people see Dragon Ball as a gritty and serious drama where people are constantly beating each other to bloody pulps, while others, like me, see the show as, well, adventurous and optimistic. I think the problem really stems from the way the original dub tries to portray the series. Dragon Ball is not very serious, and when it tries to be, always introduces some aspect to lighten up the situation. This isn't to say that the show is incapable of being serious. Goku's intense rage at Frieza after he remarks that Kuririn was nothing more than an earthling he blew to pieces, and Vegeta's selfless sacrifice to save his family and friends from the terror of Majin Buu are shining examples of this. One thing to take into consideration is how the series got where it was. It wasn't like once the 23rd Tenkaichi Budokai ended, the series suddenly got much darker and more intense. A main character is murdered nearly 100 episodes into the 153 episode run of the original Dragon Ball. Every arc was more serious than the last, and the slight change in dramatic music over time reflected that. However, they never gave up that light and happiness that the series used to portray. The show never strayed fully away from that adventurous feel. When I think of Dragon Ball, I think of an orchestra narrating the life of the simple and cheery Son Goku, a man with the voice perfectly encapsulating the character of an adult-sized child. You can feel free to disagree, but Masako Nozawa is my Son Goku. Now that I've finished mansplaining to you, I'm going to give you my personal guide to watching Dragon Ball in Japanese. Step 1. Watch Dragon Ball first. That's it.